Well, hello everyone, and thank you very much to Simone and to the British Library for inviting me to speak at this really interesting event. I'm Debora Price, and I lecture down the road at King's College London, the Institute of Gerontology, which is an institute for the research and teaching about the ageing population. Today I'm going to present some work that I've been developing with a colleague, Dr. Lynn Livesey, which was part of a wider project that was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. The essence of today's paper is to share with you some ideas about the language that government uses and why this is important. In short, the idea behind this analysis is that governments are powerful, and the way they speak both defines the terms of the debate and also how people like you and me think about ourselves. Well, when I agreed to speak at this event, I didn't, of course, know that our pensions minister, Steve Webb, was going to introduce his new Lamborghini pensions policy. But people can, in the future, invest in tax-privileged pensions during their working lives. When they retire, they can take their pension and spend it on a Lamborghini, even if that leaves them in poverty in later life. Now, Steve Webb is what we call an Orange Book liberal. He's a libertarian liberal, believing generally that the best way to deliver welfare is through private industry and markets, and that the optimal political system is one where people have maximum freedom from state control. His proposed policy has generally been greeted with delight, including from middle-aged people who are thinking about the things they might do with the money rather than buy a pension. And some of these are very sensible things, like pay off debt, pay off their mortgages, take a much-deserved holiday, replace their old appliances, help their families, and so on. Now, it's important to note, for what I'm going to say in the rest of this talk, that this is a highly individualized policy. We are being given the money to do with what we will. It's up to us as individuals. We're not being asked to give it to the state and in return have the state look after us, which might be called a more collectivist solution. It is, in short, down to us. Now, I'm not going to talk here today about that policy, although, of course, there's plenty to say. What I want to talk to you about is the cultural assumptions that lie behind that policy and this way of thinking. If we examine the public debate that's blown around since this budget announcement, it has focused very heavily on the degree of financial education and advice that people will need in order to be left with a reasonable income in later life. Left to their own devices under this policy, will they have the financial acumen to enjoy a reasonable and comfortable retirement, or will they waste their money? Or even, if not waste it, will they fail to invest it wisely and blow it all down the drain? To prevent this, the political, expert, and public debate is centering very heavily on what advice, information, and education the public needs to make sure it is the piles of money and not the money down the drain. So what I want to ask here is, what sort of citizens, what sort of people is government imagining that we are or could become for this kind of individualized policy to work? If we're going to leave people's lifelong financial welfare up to them and the markets, taking it out of state control and away from state pensions and state provision, then the government is imagining that it is possible for each one of us to amass money, to invest it wisely over the whole of our lives so that it grows and provides for us, whatever has happened to us in our lives, and however long we may live, and whatever happens in the world around us. They are imagining us to be very different from the low-earning, low-saving, over-indebted people that many of us are, sometimes overly cautious with our money, sometimes spending too much, and all struggling to find any such thing as the right investment. They are imagining that with the right education, the right advice, and the right support, we can all become prudent savers, wise investors, watch our money grow, and be comfortable for the rest of our lives. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to ask the question, what's wrong with this picture? In considering that, I'll be focusing on two areas. First, how does the government go about fulfilling its vision? And second, what implications does that have for public policy and public debate? In trying to turn us into the type of citizen that they want us to be, the government is tapping into a long tradition of political influence on cultural change. They want us to be different and to change our way of life. They want us to have a different relationship with money, with housing, with savings, with debt, with consumption, with spending, with intergenerational exchanges of money and assets. In short, all these features that make up our everyday family and money practices. And governments are very powerful players in effecting cultural change. We see this here in a quote from a woman who is credited with marked effects on British culture in a host of domains, who really understood this phenomenon. Margaret Thatcher, in an interview with the Sunday Times in 1981, "It isn't that I set out on economic policies, it's that I set out really to change the approach. And changing the approach, changing the economics is the means of changing that approach. If you change the approach, you really are after the heart and soul of the nation. Economics are the method. The object is to change the heart and soul." If we think about the context for what the government is trying to do, it's very complex. Since the 1980s, money, finance, and investment has played a much greater part in the lives of ordinary people, with the right to buy council houses, huge increases in home ownership and mortgages, sell-offs of the privatized industries, many more financial products for savings, insurance, investments, increases in house prices, and ever-rising consumer debt with debit cards, credit cards, and loans. We've also had scandal after scandal in these financial industries, difficulties in predicting life expectancies, and lots of instances of inefficient markets, overpriced products, lack of transparency, and a bad deal for consumers. In this context, by the late 1990s, there was growing concern about the very high rates of pensioner poverty, with a third of pensioners living below the poverty line. And when the government started to properly investigate these things, we see, for example, in the year 2000, that half the adult population has less than £750 in savings, and 10% have no savings at all. So lots of people started to become aware that the financial markets for the provision of money in old age didn't seem to be working very well. And the solution that they engineered, which fitted with their vision that this all could work and must work, was that we must educate the public better. So we had the birth of a comprehensive financial education program and also a new regulator in what was then the financial services industry. So before giving you a taste of how this has all been done, I want to pause and ask the question, to what extent is this policy of education and advice really going to help the deep-rooted problems of social and financial inequality and poverty? A financial education program sounds very sensible in today's consumerist and market-driven world. How can you argue against that? But it's important to ask, what do we already know about money in later life from a very large body of research? Well, there is no evidence that financial education has any substantive long-term impact on financial outcomes. The key determinants of poverty and low income in later life are things like the design of the state pension, the health and care systems, social class at birth, gender, ethnicity, how highly educated you are, what job you did, how many children you had, your employment history, your marital history, your family history, and your health. Employer welfare, like wages and pensions and other support, is often an almost random factor in people's lives, and one over which they have little control. The location of housing, rather than the decision to buy, determines the growth rate in that asset. A matter of geography, rather than financial decision-making. and factors having nothing at all to do with the financial decisions that people make and over which they have no power or control are often the most important in determining their financial welfare. For example, average stock market returns, interest rates, the price of gilts, and so on. Very importantly, absolutely no one can predict in their 20s, 30s, or 40s what the situation will be like in their 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s. It is nothing to do with financial education and will mostly be influenced by things over which they have very little control. So from the perspective of someone like me, the solution that governments of various colour over the last couple of decades have fixed on is very far from the causes of the problem. But since the start of the century, the ability or capability of individuals to act as informed consumers has assumed new political importance. And what we see very clearly emerging through the policy documents of the 2000s is two complementary but very dominant discourses of financial capability. First, that the solution to structural problems in the provision of financial welfare and in market failures is to educate individuals and to create even more differentiated financial products. And two, that people, rather than governments, as individual consumers, could act as market regulators through using their consumer power, if only they were sufficiently financially capable. So this is the highly individualized discourse that has carried through into our Lamborghini pensions policy, and the implications of it are very severe. Because by presenting the solution as one of education and advice, this enables government to say, if we give our citizens enough education and make them financially capable, then if they don't have enough money in later life, surely it's their fault and not ours. So what I want to do now is to give you just a few examples in the time that we have of how the very subtle use of language in everyday policy documents leads us all to thinking in this way. We see these two strands in one of the Financial Services Authority's earliest documents. The aim of the consumer education strategy is to help consumers make informed choices and manage their financial affairs better. It should also, through growing consumer pressure, increase competition in financial services markets, leading to innovation, better quality, and better value for money. And so you see here that while it all sounds quite sensible, what it means is that individuals, that is you, must change your behavior to meet the needs of the market. You are no longer a citizen of equal value to the state, but you're a consumer who must play your various parts in the functioning of the financial services industry. So perhaps you can see here what this language serves to do. It takes us firmly in one direction, that failures in the government project for the provision of financial welfare in late life through the private sector and the markets becomes not the result of flawed government policies, but of flawed people. If it doesn't work, it's not their fault in designing the system, it's yours for not being sufficiently informed. The language that it's all our individual fault continues throughout the decade. In this extract from a Financial Services Authority report in 2003, consumers are grappling with worries about their pensions and saving, insurance protection, and build-up of debt. There remain high risks to consumers from inadequate understanding of financial concepts and products, and this at a time when consumers are increasingly being asked to take on more responsibility for their own financial long-term planning. When we think hard about this kind of comment, we see that the political and economic environment, which has shrunk state provision and created these high risks to consumers, is not the subject of comment at all. While the high risks are recognized, these are interpreted here simplistically and wrongly as resulting simply from the inadequate understanding of financial affairs by consumers. In actual fact, risk to your money comes from a large number of places, and mostly they are outside your control. Interest rates, investment rates, currency exchange rates, stock market returns, the value of capital, recessions, changing markets, unemployment, family structures, poor health, increasing longevity, and so on. We see the failed consumer everywhere. Here in a Treasury report from 2007. People do not shop around for financial products. They're insensitive to price. They buy the wrong thing. They fail to understand the financial risks that they're taking. In this extract, we again see that the government discourse is highly individualized. The citizen consumer, that is you, is blamed for failures to secure long-term financial welfare for yourself over the life course, because you continually do the wrong thing. The government role in any of this is absent. To solve the problem, you must become a better citizen. According to extracts like these, if you do that, you will avoid the consequences of doing the wrong things, which is the counterpoint to doing the right thing, which you would do if only you were financially capable. Consumers doing the right thing is key to Otto Torresen in advising on a generic financial advice system. He poses the solution as creating more capable consumers this way. For consumers, doing the right thing with money will be easier. They'll understand their options, and so on. Making the right financial decisions means more people will enjoy the financial security and independence, having saved and protected themselves and their families. We once again see in this quote that the problem is framed so that if citizens take the wrong decisions, it is their fault if their families and children fall into ruin. There is no room in this language for us to think that perhaps it is the state that should be providing the safety net for individuals and families. But most importantly, there is never any analysis of what the right thing is. Who decides this, and when do you judge? This report was written in 2008, the beginning of a global financial crisis that saw equities tumble, banks fold, widespread recession, none of which was foreseen by the financial advisors who, according to this construction, ought to have known what the right thing was. What was even the most financially capable person to do? There were no options. What about the person who had saved all their lives but had to turn their pension into an annuity at this historically unprecedented low time for annuity and interest rates? What was the right investment for them? And what did that have to do with them? They have no control over these things. The right thing, especially thinking across the whole life course, is a myth. So even people who have tried to conform to government expectations and behave as prudent financial planners and responsible savers have endured falling interest rates, poor returns on saving and investments, and capital losses in financial markets. And their hard-earned houses are now under threat from social care policies too. These are now the abandoned saver citizens of past, present, and future, for whom the sweep of their complex lives, contemporary history, and economic times have left them with few and dwindling options. We might have thought, and indeed many of us did think, that the global financial crisis, with its devastating effects on people's prospects and incomes, that had nothing to do with their own skills, knowledge, or attitudes, and all to do with global events outside their control, might have made us think of more collective solutions to some of these problems. In fact, we see the opposite. Ever more explicit attempts to make us think this is an individual problem. This recent quotation from Caroline Rooks, Chief Executive of the Money Advice Service. We're all vulnerable to events, global financial crisis, personal health issue. It can be completely unpredictable. To be capable of dealing with these events effectively, we need the right skills and knowledge, appropriate attitudes and motivations, and opportunities to act. We see here the perhaps bizarre idea that with the right financial education, we can individually, regardless of what has happened to us in our lives, financially overcome such problems as a global financial crisis, dementia, stroke, or even unexpectedly and against all the odds, living a ripe, old, healthy age of 115. Where does this all lead me to? My argument is that by using this language and framing the debates in this way, we all end up discussing how to educate people to make the system work. We discuss nothing else. In other words, by controlling the discourse, Non-market-based discussions of welfare are closed. Any need for the examination of the structural causes of inequality in old age are closed. It prevents a critique of individualization and the use of markets, and the failures become our failures as consumers. The dominant idea of delivering adequacy in personal finances via the financial services industry is unchallenged, and any analysis of social inequality is marginalized. So Simone asked us to end with 5 key points. These are mine. It's not only what government and other powerful people say, it's how they say it. The discourse determines what gets done and how we respond. It opens up some allowable conversations and closes down others. By making the conversation one about the education and skill of the public, market-based solutions are the only solutions we are discussing. And not only are collective solutions sidelined, but it also means that when things go wrong, it's conceived of by everyone as your own fault and not the fault of the government. I hope that even if you don't agree with me, I've given you all something to think about today, and I look forward to our future discussions.